Today I'd like to talk a bit about worrying, but I'll take a bit of a run at the topic from a distance. When I'm working with someone on a psychological issue, I often like to use a metaphor to get the ideas across, preferably a metaphor from the person's actual life. If the topic is worry and they're a skier, we're in business. I was once with a person who'd never skied before, and their initial idea of what it involved was to point their skis down the hill and go, which, if you ski, you know is a recipe for disaster. Well, no, most of the time you're not pointing straight at the bottom, especially at first. Mostly you're pointing across the hill, not straight down. When people start skiing, they often get really anxious. Maybe they've been tobogganing before. This is a wide, flat surface on the ground, and you're sitting on it, really low. If life gets scary, you can just roll off. You get on skis, and you realize it's a totally different thing. Each ski is really narrow, not wide, and it's deliberately slippery, obviously, and there are two of them, meaning they can cross each other. Also not a good thing. And you're standing up. So there's further to fall. And you're standing on snow, or let's face it, half the time, ice. Tilted ice. And you realize pretty soon that if you just start straight down to the village, you're going to go faster and faster and faster until you die. And that bothers people. So they tense up, which doesn't really help. But skiing is all about projecting yourself into the future. It's like sixth grade math class where you have 2 points on a graph and you draw a line connecting them and then you project it onward into infinity. Your skis are lines and you're projecting them forward to see where they're headed. And the answer is always the same. You're headed to disaster. If you're pointed downhill and you keep going, you're going to crash. If you're going to the right side of the hill, there are trees over there and you're going to hit a tree. The left, same thing. When you're skiing, in every moment, you are headed for injury. The only way you don't get injured is if you change the line before you get there. You're heading left, you turn, you're pointed downhill for an instant, and then you're heading right again. Then you're heading left and then right. And so on. Ice skating is very similar. Every direction you're going to hit the boards if you don't stop or turn. Sailing, to use another completely bourgeois sport, is exactly the same. You're either headed out into the middle of the ocean, which is bad, or you're headed for the rocks, also bad. And life is exactly the same. No matter what you're doing, you can project yourself forward in time, and if things do not change, you're headed for disaster. You're sitting here watching a video. If you do this 24 hours a day, you will have a terrible life. You're eating. Keep it up, and you will weigh 1,000 pounds. You're not eating. You'll starve to death. You're working. Work continuously, and you'll burn out. You're sitting on the toilet. If you don't get up sooner or later, you'll be found there by the neighbors. If in every moment, if you project it forward, you're headed for trouble. Well, okay, mostly we don't think about it too much. You've gotten off the toilet so many times that you don't think you're going to get stuck there like Elvis. But what if it's something like skiing that makes you anxious? What if it's something you associate with threat? Well, then it's tempting to draw that line forward and see that disaster sits at the end of it. You've got to talk a week from now, and you're not prepared. If that doesn't change, you're going to look like an idiot. Your shoulder hurts. If it doesn't stop hurting, you're going to have to live with it your whole life. Your boss isn't happy with that chunk of work you did. If she keeps on like that, you'll be fired and you will never get a reference letter, and then you'll be unemployed and in poverty forever. Your partner is cranky. Maybe the relationship is over. You were kind of bored hanging out with your friends last night. Maybe you don't like them anymore, or you don't like people anymore, and you're doomed to spend your entire life alone and friendless. Your teenager is late coming home. Maybe they'll never come home. They've been murdered, killed in a car crash. We take what's happening in the moment and we draw a line forward into the future, and we find disaster waiting there. And then we react to that disaster, which hasn't actually happened. And the more we're thinking about something that's important to us, where we feel insecure and possibly threatened, the stickier our mind gets. It's harder to come back to the present and sit here knowing that things keep changing, that the line isn't straight, that yes, we're heading for a cliff, but we're going to turn before we get there. The lesson of this typically comes not from the direction we're looking, which is forward. It comes from looking backward, the past. Every bloody time I have a talk, I get all anxious because it's not written yet, and I think I'm gonna look like an idiot, and then I always come up with something. It'll come. Every time my kid is late, I think he's been killed, but he's always late. I can expect that. And then he shows up. Every time my partner and I quarrel, I think the relationship is over. And then we get over it and it isn't. Every time the boss gives me feedback and I think she's terminally furious, I do the revisions and she's happy. Same will probably happen this time. The line into the future is a delusion of permanence. It's an assumption that nothing changes, but it does. And if the change is up to us, then we can bring it about. We can turn our skis. If my weight is creeping up, I can do something about that. If my cholesterol is getting higher, I can take action. If I want to get out of debt, I can change course. And if we look behind us, we can often find lots of examples of how change really did come about. If you talk to someone who's worrying, or if you talk to the part of yourself that's doing the worrying, it will usually argue back. As you go down the runway, the worried part of yourself sees that the plane is going fast and it's flat on the ground, and you know the end of the runway is just up ahead. What if we don't lift up? Yep, that'd be bad, but it will. It's not about denying the truth of my worry. If my child never came home, yes, that would be awful. It would. It's about recognizing that we're not stressed about the disaster because the disaster hasn't happened. It's recognizing that we're stressed by this presumption that the disaster will happen. The sense of certainty that this course we're on isn't going to change, even though it's changed over and over again in the past. And sometimes change is in our court. It's up to us. If I don't do anything, that talk isn't going to write itself, and I might not be absolutely sure I can do it. Maybe this is the one time I can't come up with anything, but I can shift to something I know I can do. I can sit at my desk for half an hour jotting down ideas, or looking for the file of that old talk I was thinking of adapting. Is that guaranteed to solve the problem? No. But if the problem is going to be solved, that's how it'll happen. By letting go of the product, the great talk, and the disaster, standing there with nothing to say, and focusing on something I know I can do. Sit in a chair with a pen in my hand. I don't know for sure that I can go through my entire life without skiing off the track and into the trees. But I can trust that I do know how to turn my skis, and I can look ahead to set up my next turn. I'm not worried by disaster. I'm worried by a fantasy of disaster. And that fantasy is what it is. It's just a thought. You can get How to Be Miserable from your local bookseller or from Amazon. The link's below.